The summer of soccer concluded on Sunday night with the Copa America final down in Miami. Argentina being crowned back-to-back Copa America champions with a 1-0 win over Colombia. Nick Guzman, James Birle, Griffin Stevenson, here to break down not just that final, but the entire tournament for you. It's been an interesting tournament. There's been a lot of stuff, beyond the game of soccer that seems like it's gotten in the way of this Copa America. But I'm interested to hear your guys' opinions of who performed this tournament, who underperformed, and just sort of the competition as a whole. But first off, James, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. I was doing a bit better when we were talking about the Euros just moments ago. A little bit sadder that we're talking about the Copa America because we have covered it now a couple of times. We know what happened to our United States national team here at this tournament. Underwhelming performance from them, but overall a disappointing tournament, really, when you consider some of the ways it was organized. But on the field, at least, Messi and Di Maria in his final Argentina game lifts the trophy, and they go back to back to back in terms of major titles. First team to do that since Spain, 2008, 2010, 2012. I think it's going to draw comparisons naturally because of that. So we'll get into all that. Nick, you're shaking your head. I know why you're shaking your head, and I agree. But
We'll get into it.
This Argentina team has done something special, and it shouldn't be overlooked. And just happy for Lionel Messi as well, who did it in his hometown.
James, they haven't done anything special. I'm just gonna get that out of the way. This is honestly, when you look at who they played besides Colombia, this might as well have been a Gold Cup. Like, I don't care in my mind, but I'm getting into it. As with regards to how I'm feeling fine. We'll get into it later. I'm mad at the tournament organizers. I went into the city to watch this one. I was in the Bronx for the Euro final. I made it to a bar. I ate an appetizer. I ate an entree. The kickoff did not start. I made it back to the Bronx to watch the game, and it was the 35th minute. That's how much of a mess this tournament ended up being.
And you missed nothing in terms of the opening 35 minutes of the game. The game itself,
first 85 minutes of the game.
The first 85 minutes of the game. Griffin, you called it on FUV FC last week, saying that this game was going to be, you weren't looking forward to it. And I was like, you know what? It's a Copa America final. I'm going to get my hopes up. And we're going to get into the on-the-field stuff later. There wasn't really that much it was a typical Copa America final, in my opinion. But I think when you talk about this final, you have to talk about everything that went wrong before the match. And I think that's where we should start, because this tournament was a sham. It was a disgrace in regards to CONMEBOL and their organization. It was on full display in this final. Overcrowding outside the gates before the stadium. People without tickets, clamoring outside the gates. At one point, CONMEBOL, it was also 95 degrees with a heat index of 100 in Miami. Dangerously high heat, high humidity. And at one point, CONMEBOL or the security guards decided to just open the gates and let people in, not checking tickets for a period, no security parameters. And it's incredibly, incredibly dangerous. There were videos of Colombian fans climbing through vents to try to get in. Yes, this is their first major final in many, many years. So you understand the want to get in that badly. But for a tournament like this, for CONMEBOL to not take the proper security measures, a lot of people online have been blaming the United States for the organization of this tournament and U.S. Soccer for the organization of this tournament. This has been almost all of CONMEBOL and CONCACAF together, two really incompetent organizations working together to try to organize this tournament. The United States hosted the Copa America 8 years ago. That was almost entirely run by U.S. Soccer and the United States Soccer Federation, and that tournament was an overwhelming success. But because it was organized by U.S. Soccer and the USSF, they got the profit. CONMEBOL obviously won the profit. They wanted to control this time around, so they were in charge of organizing things like security and putting this tournament on. And it was dangerous last night in Miami. And, beyond it just being embarrassing, people could have gotten seriously hurt. I mean, there were people inside the stadium without tickets. And to have the kickoff delayed by an hour and 15 minutes just because you weren't prepared for these kinds of crowds, I think it's an absolute disgrace to the sport. And I think there also needs to be some blame on the fans who attended, both the Colombian fans and the Argentinian fans, to go without tickets and try to force your way in and sort of cause the destruction that they caused. Yes, security setup and the event should have been organized much better, but there also needs to be some personal accountability, in my opinion.
Yeah, there always is meant to be personal accountability. These people, in their own right, chose to do what they did. But I go back to the organization. Why were so many people trying to go in without tickets? Well, as of Saturday afternoon, this is on bnsports.com, Ticketmaster had the cheapest ticket to get into the Copa America final, albeit this is a day before the match, $1,932.11. That's the cheapest ticket. I understand this is the day before the game, but I promise you they weren't much better in the months leading up to it. The fact of the matter is, CONMEBOL were incredibly greedy trying to organize this tournament in conjunction with CONCACAF, who aren't absolved of any blame. And yes, does it look embarrassing for the U.S.? This is true. It does. I don't know if you can say that the country is unprepared to host the tournament, considering they host sporting events every year, every summer. They host every Gold Cup. They host the Copa America 2016. They hosted what is still the most attended World Cup of all time in 1994. The 2026 World Cup is going to be organized by FIFA and will be organized in a much, much higher standard. And it's not going to have these issues. CONMEBOL and CONCACAF are absolutely responsible for this. Yes, there's some personal agency that you need to criticize here, but the fact of the matter is the organization of this tournament completely and utterly shambolic from start to finish, whether it's the pitches, whether it's the dimensions of the fields, whether it's the security or the ticket prices, or the referees' statements coming out and saying that certain referees' decisions were correct and wrong. That goes against almost everything that you're supposed to do with referees unions by protecting these individuals who are going to work. And specifically last night before the final, the security, not only was it poorly prepared, but I think it responded incredibly dramatically, terribly, tackling people and injuring people. There was a credentialed journalist who was apprehended by security in a violent manner. That person's going to work. That in no way should that have happened. It's an utter embarrassment. It makes the whole country look bad going into hosting the 2026 World Cup, and they're not entirely absolved of blame. I think that CONMEBOL, being the organizers, on the ground level, you have to do a better job at contracting security services and all these things. But maybe they didn't, coordinate with people at U.S. Soccer and CONCACAF who had done it before. But this is just, it was a disaster, really a disaster of a tournament. You saw empty stadiums, not that infrequently, unless it was Colombia or Argentina playing, or Brazil or Mexico. It was a pretty good chance that not every seat was going to be filled. And I go back to the ticket prices again. Absolutely ridiculous what they were charging on Ticketmaster to be able to go and watch these matches. So very poorly organized tournament from the get-go. And I feel for the people who were injured and affected by that. There were some kids who were like in 100-degree heat, packed in like sardines in front of a fence, couldn't get any water, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was a very scary, almost reminiscent of the Hillsborough massacre. So I think that there's a lot to criticize, and they got to go back to the drawing board if they ever want to host a tournament with better standards, because this did happen in the U.S., but this could have happened with this type of organization in any country, and it would have been this bad. So there's a lot of apologizing and correcting that they're going to have to do moving forward. It was absolutely unacceptable.
I think you guys nailed it right on the head with all of your takes about the situation. Obviously, I think for this tournament as a whole, CONMEBOL cheaped on security. They cheaped on venue support. They cheaped on referees, which I think hindered the quality of a lot of the games. I think match in and match out, whether you disagree or think that calls were in favor of one team of another, I'm not going to get into that. But the fact of the matter is that the referees let their matches get away from them a lot of times. We saw Colombia committed 17 fouls last night. That is too many. And when a team is comfortable fouling that much, it means you as a referee have failed at your job. And I think overall it goes to show that this was not a serious tournament. Hopefully the World Cup will be much better, and it will be better. I think, as you mentioned, people need to start looking at the federation that organized this and not the United States as a whole. we were talking about this before the show. Hard Rock Stadium has literally hosted a Super Bowl and had zero problems, especially with literally Shakira performing at halftime. So all of these extended factors that you could bring up saying, this is why this and this, we can't have it in the US. No, we know, like, the venues know how to run tournaments, but they have to be helped with a friendly budget and competent organizers from the group that is running a tournament. And so I think those problems will be fixed in 2026. Hopefully there are not people breaking on the doors at MetLife Stadium 2 years from now, but we will have to see. But I think after we talk about this, obviously, scenario, I think the final as a whole, I was just disappointing, but it went exactly how I thought it would. I said it last week's episode of FUV FC, going to go to extra time. I thought maybe there would have been one or two more goals. But at the end of the day, neither team really stood out to me. I was pretty disappointed in Colombia's decisiveness going forward. I think there's a lot of times where I'd like to see more shots on goal, but ultimately Argentina got their good chance and they took it. And a very Lautaro Martinez finish propelled them to victory, but got to give him his credit. Top goal scorer of the tournament. Argentina, I think everyone knew back to front, they're the best team in the tournament, World Cup champion, FIFA ranked number 1. It really was just always going to be them. For the most part, I think people kind of hoped for Colombia victory, but at the end of the day, Argentina was just too good.
Yeah, and regarding the match, I thought I noticed, I was watching the game with my dad, and I noticed in extra time, you know how Fox has the yellow card counter above the scoreboard?
The dumbest thing ever, by the way.
But
so
there were 2 yellow cards for Colombia and 1 for Argentina in like the 105th minute. And I was like, what are we doing? Yeah. There's been so many fouls in this game, and the fact that more cards weren't shown out, it killed. There were so many fouls, it kills any sort of momentum that the game was, that either team was gaining, and it's by design. It's what these teams want to do, but makes it a really sort of frustrating product to watch on the field. There were definitely some notable moments in this game, namely Lionel Messi's injury to his ankle, which swelled up like a balloon, which was incredible to watch. And then seeing him sob on the sidelines got me a little emotional. But I think that was a notable moment. And then I was shocked at how long it took Scaloni to sub on Lautaro Martinez, considering the success he's had in this tournament. I thought Julian Alvarez was pretty invisible for most of the game. And then Martinez comes on in extra time and scores the winner. But Colombia had a positive start, but I think Stu Holden mentioned that when you're pressing at that kind of level that they were with that intensity, it's hard to sustain for a full game, and they tired out, and then Argentina kind of took control in the second half and into extra time. And I think they're the deserved winners, even if that final itself, in terms of what happened on the field, it was a disappointing watch as a neutral.
Yeah, and I would go on to say that Argentina really didn't have any major test up until that point. Like you mentioned, Griffin, a glorified Gold Cup win in a way. I still think they're the deserved winners, even considering all that. In a way that they kind of had a similar path to the final that England did at the Euros, in that they didn't have to knock down any big giants really to get to that stage. And that is true for Argentina, but they made everything look easy in their path, except for that Ecuador game, because, well, it quite frankly was easy for them. They didn't have to play their best football in order to win these matches. And against Colombia, they just weathered the storm for a little bit in the early part of that match. And that was always what it was going to be, I think. If Argentina just doesn't concede to this Colombia team, they'll find a way to score later. And that's honestly a pretty good recipe for success. They know how to win. Yes, I don't think they're even remotely close to how good that late 2000s, early 2010s Spain team is. But to say that it's not a massive achievement to have done what they've done, I think that's a bit reductive. I think that 2021 Copa America victory, where they were not the favorites and had to go in a very difficult place to play, albeit not in front of a lot of fans, and then beat Brazil in the final, and then follow that up with a World Cup victory against Mbappe and France, who were honestly, the way Mbappe was playing at that tournament, he could have won that all by himself. So and then to go and follow that up with yes, a tournament that you were expected to win, but then to go out and do it, it speaks volumes about what Lionel Scaloni has done at the helm of this Argentina team. I think that also opens up a whole discussion about coaching at the international level. Did anybody know who Lionel Scaloni was before he took over this Argentina team? Did anybody know who Luis de la Fuente was before he took over the Spain team? I didn't know who those guys were. So I think that it speaks to what a lot of international soccer is about. It's not getting the best. It's not about having the best. It's not about playing the best. It's about playing the right way, having the right coach with the right mentality, stepping up in the right moments. And that's what this Argentina team does. That's why they're number one in the world. That's why they've won the last two Copa Americas, and it's why they're the world champions. I'm just happy that Messi gets to be a part of it because, as we saw last night, and I think Messi started to consider, he's not going to be able to do it forever. I think the World Cup probably going to be the last time we see Messi put on the Albiceleste for Argentina.
Yeah, and I think this is a good time to I think we can zoom out of this final, which didn't necessarily have too much exciting stuff happening in it, to talk about sort of this tournament as a whole, similar to what we did with the Euros, and a team that surprised us and had a really good tournament. And then maybe we can also pick a team who was disappointing. And I feel like we might have the same team in mind in regards to who was disappointing at this Copa America. But we'll start with the positives. And Griffin, I'll start with you. Is there a team at this Copa America, not Argentina who won it, but a team who surprised you with their performance and how far they went?
Well, I think two come to mind. I think one of them more deserved so than the other. I think Colombia, you got to look at and say that this is a good team. Up until last night's loss, they were 28 games unbeaten. Debatably the most informed team in the world. James Rodriguez playing out of his mind. 6 assists, 20 chances created. Player of the tournament. No one even comes close. I mean, I guess if you really focus on goals, you could look at Lautaro Martinez. But I think as a whole, Colombia played great. I think they did a good job to get to the final. I would have liked a little bit of a better performance from them in said final, but I think as a whole, the country of Colombia is going to be very happy. As you mentioned, Nick, they haven't been in the final in a very, very long time, and it's always good as a country when you can come together, even if you're losing, and support the team. So I think they're one of those teams that I think, yes, they might not have been as big of a surprise to most people. I think a lot of people had them pegged as a team that's going to shake things up, but as a whole, making it to the final is never a bad thing. And then the second team that I have, who I think surprised a lot of people, we talked about them in last week's podcast episode. Maybe not the most exciting route to the semifinal, but you got to give Canada their flowers. Jesse Marsh comes in spring of this year, laughing stock, quite honestly. I remember, James, you and I were joking about how he couldn't even succeed at Leeds, got them relegated. And now it's almost the start of a new era for Canada, where it seems like they're going to be heavily focusing on their youth development heading into the 2026 World Cup. Do I think they're going to be as good in the next tournament? Probably not. But when, especially in a tournament where the US and Mexico go crashing out in the group stage and you make it to the semifinals, it's always a good sign. It's always a good sign. And I think they obviously lost in the third place match in a little bit of heartbreaking fashion. I don't know. I think these CONMEBOL teams are really good at penalties. And I think these North American teams got to figure it out. But overall, I think they fought hard. Like we mentioned, not really like many spectacular victories. A lot of, getting lucky, beating 10-man teams. But at the end of the day, you won. And I don't want to hear anyone say it's undeserved. I think you could say it's easy, but not undeserved that Canada got to that semifinal. And people need to look at this and say, good for them. I think the tournament sort of marinates, obviously they got some hype, but then some people were questioning them when they got eliminated. I think as it starts to marinate and we head into early September international break, I think we'll assess this Canada team and be like, yeah, they did a good thing. And I think everyone's got to give them their flowers.
Yeah, I think Canada is obviously the first name that comes to mind, having gotten to the semifinal. I mean, if you want to just go around the horn of teams that performed above their standards, Panama, having gotten out of the group. I mean, they did get thumped by Colombia, and rightfully so in the eventual knockout game. And they did have that red card that gave them the crutch to get by the U.S., but they still did it. They still got that goal from Jose Fajardo, and they still weathered the storm against Bolivia when it looked like maybe the Bolivians were going to come and cut that lead back down. I also want to say Uruguay were really spotless in this tournament until they faced Colombia. And that red card to Denny Munoz gave Colombia a very clear idea for how to approach that second half, which was to sit very far back. And that made it really difficult for Uruguay. I know they were a man up. We've talked all the time about how sometimes going up a man can be a hindrance. Colombia had a very clear style of play. They already had the 1-0 lead. They had 45 minutes where they just had to absorb pressure and get rid. And they only allowed Uruguay to 2 shots on target. So that's hats off to Colombia for what they were able to produce. And that's a little bit of context, understanding that Uruguay lost to Colombia, who otherwise had a fantastic tournament. Again, though, they were one of the favorites coming into it, so I don't want to spend too much time giving them praise. I think Costa Rica had a great showing. Honestly, they did. I know they didn't get out of their group, but 4 points in a group that included Colombia and Brazil, and many other groups that would have been enough to get out, but that 3-0 loss to Colombia gave them a difficult goal differential to overcome. They not only beat Paraguay, but they also got a draw against Brazil in their opening game. I know it's a lowly Brazil, not the same team that we've come to expect being very, very good at this level. But this is a Costa Rica team who is under a brand new crop of players, very few recognizable names, unlike what there was 10 years ago at the 2014 World Cup when they had Keylor Navas, Brian Ruiz, Oscar Duarte, Celso Borges, Joel Campbell. It's a very different Costa Rica team led by a much younger core of players. They were able to be better than the sum of their parts. Ultimately, they don't get out of a tough group, but they leave with their heads held high. As for Canada, yeah, I mean, they had really, like, they got to the semifinal. It looks better when the U.S. and Mexico don't do great, but in Jesse Marsh, since he's taken over this Canada team, he's got 1 win in 8 matches. Their best performance was that third place game against Uruguay, where they were the better team. If they had taken more chances, I think that game, they avoid it going to penalties and they win it outright. So hats off to them for playing that well, but they didn't eventually come away with anything. They finished 4th. But getting out of that group, good for them. They did play against a 10-man Chile and Peru. They got on the better end of good situations, but they took advantage of it. And that's what that's what good teams do. I think they're not a great team, but they did what they had to do in the right moments. And I think Venezuela has to be another team. Griffin,
that's what I was going to say. I was going to say, building off of the team that Canada beat on penalties. Venezuela, granted, they had an easier group, but to get all 9 points from group play and then lose by a penalty, potentially being a team that would challenge Argentina better in that semifinal, I think as a whole, I think they're good. They can look at this tournament and say, this is something to build off as well, just because going flawless in the group is definitely nothing to laugh at. I think guys like Solomon Rondon up front too as well, 2 goals in this tournament. I think he played very, very, very well. And I think they're a team from South America that probably gets overlooked a fair amount. And, who knows? Maybe when it comes time to the World Cup, if they can qualify, a team that can definitely shake things up.
And yeah, there weren't necessarily any big heavy hitters in Venezuela's group, but it is still a tough group with a lot of talented teams with Ecuador, Mexico, and Jamaica.
All at a similar level.
A lot of similar level teams. To win all 3 of those games is very impressive. And yes, you would have liked to beat Canada on penalties and get to a semifinal, but I think Venezuela do deserve their flowers for going 9 points out of 9 in the group stage. Now, in terms of teams that disappointed us, I think there's one obvious answer. There's also a couple others, but I think I'm gonna start with this one and throw it out there. The United States of America had such a disappointing tournament. Yes, we're all U.S. fans, but to crash out in the group stage in a group with Panama, Bolivia, and Uruguay, I mean, that second place spot had our name written all over it. And Tim Way gets a red card in the second game. Unlike what Colombia did when they went down to 10 men, with Munoz got that red card in the semifinal in terms of being able to soak up that pressure and maintaining their style of play. The U.S., when they went down to 10 men against Panama, looked like they didn't know what to do. And they looked disorganized, and Panama punished them for 2 goals despite the U.S., taking that lead on that Balogun goal. And then that was kind of the writing on the wall. The Uruguay game, even though it was a positive first 15 and 20 minutes, the U.S. created next to nothing in that game until the very end, and even then, those were half chances. Uruguay were the better team, and the U.S. win one game, they lose two, and they go home early. And I think, to me, they're without doubt the most disappointing team at this tournament when you consider what this competition was supposed to be in regards to 2026 and in terms of preparation and the last real strong competition that this team's going to get in competitive matches before 2 years from now and that tournament. And it was so disappointing to watch this team crash out. And Gregg Berhalter has now been fired. We'll see who comes in and replaces him, but I think it's hard to pick a team that had a worse tournament than our U.S. men's national team.
Yeah, I think they're the obvious choice, not only because we're all coming from the U.S., we're all Americans, we're all fans, and we've all made it very clear how disappointed and upset we are about how it went. And I don't think we need to really delve deep into all the specifics of what went wrong. We know about the red card. We know about the response to it. We know it wasn't good enough. But what I really want to say right here is, were the U.S. that bad at any moment in this tournament? I don't think they played egregiously poorly against Panama, even after the red card. Did they look unorganized at times? Yes. Did they not have their best stuff? Did they struggle to get out of their own half? Yes, but those are all things that you kind of expect when you go down a man. As for the game against Uruguay, they were toe-to-toe. That game could have ended 0-0, and I mean, probably should have ended 0-0, considering Uruguay's goal was probably offside. They didn't get a good look at it with the VAR. That was a close game. Were the U.S. doing enough to ever threaten the goal? No, they never looked like scoring. Maybe one time that pass from Gio Reyna to Haji Wright where he had a weak touch and had to run his entire body around the ball, and they closed down the space. This wasn't an abjectly awful watch if you're a U.S. fan. It ended up being that, considering the context and that they weren't able to overcome the adversity. But I think and we'll say this again, it went to show that maybe we just aren't as good as we hoped we would be at this point. And I think, yes, some of that you can criticize the coach, but you have to look at the players that we have at this national team. Are any of them, besides Christian Pulisic, and you can make the case for a couple others, moving the needle really at their clubs? I think you could say that Anthony Robinson, player of the year for Fulham, one of the best fullbacks in the Premier League, you can put him in that category as well. I think when Tyler Adams is healthy for a long stretch of time, you can put him in that category, but he hasn't been that. Weston McKennie, when he's confident, maybe, but he hasn't really been that guy at Juventus, neither has Tim Weah. Chris Richards been an important piece of Crystal Palace, sort of in and out of the lineup, mostly in the lineup, but is he a guy that, Crystal Palace fans turn and say he's the reason we are so solid at the back? Not quite. We're not quite there where we can look at a group that has Uruguay in it and think that if it comes down to that last game against Uruguay, we should be the better team. I don't think we should expect that. And I'm not saying that anybody was expecting that, but when you understand the context of what went wrong against Panama, a group stage exit starts to make a lot more sense for this U.S. team. It should still never be acceptable. That's no excuse. Gregg Berhalter, unfortunately, doesn't survive the fallout of this, and probably he shouldn't. I think there are things he got wrong at this tournament, but ultimately this tournament wasn't on him. It was on the players. And I think that a fresh voice going forward is hopefully going to be a good thing for this U.S. team. Now, they're far from the only disappointment at this tournament, though. And there's a common theme about this, is that it comes from the traditionally best teams in CONCACAF. And I would throw another CONCACAF team in Jamaica, in addition to the U.S. and Mexico, who really, really didn't live up to their own hype. But, of course, the Federation, the Jamaican Football Federation, gets in their own way deeply than anything. So I think we're going to spend a little bit more time on the U.S. before we switch gears over to Mexico, right, Griffin?
Yeah, but you can talk about Mexico. You can talk about the U.S. men's national team. I think, obviously, there were disappointments. But like you said, me personally, I think one stupid mistake probably cost them getting to the knockout stages. And, for me, I actually don't think the disappointment from this tournament is as cut and dry as it may seem. I don't think it's the United States. I think there is another team that has an infinitely more talented roster who only won one game in the group stage and then lost to a 10-man team on penalties in the next round, and that's Brazil. I'm gonna say it. I'm gonna say it quite frankly. I think Brazil sucks. I don't think Brazil is a good team. I don't think Brazil is good enough at all. I have never seen someone's Ballon d'Or hopes get torpedoed like they have with Vinicius Jr. in this tournament. The amount of talent they have on this roster, they should not be drawing to Costa Rica. I get it, Colombia's decent, but they still should probably be beating Colombia. And then you lose on penalties to a 10-man Uruguay team. This was a team that's supposed to be one of the favorites, if not the favorite, to win this tournament. This is a team that everyone's like, oh, wait for next year. It's always wait for the next big tournament where they inevitably choke. I think Brazil is the country that needs to be scared. I didn't see anything good from them really creatively going forward. What I saw is a lot of balls down the wings and then just wasted crosses that get deflected. And I think for the most part, I was going to joke a team like I was going to say insert bad team name here could defend against that, but Costa Rica could literally defend against that for the most part. And I think they are going to be the ones that really need to look inwards ahead of this 2026 World Cup. I don't think they're going to have Neymar for 2026. They might. I get you're missing like the main guy, and they're coming off an overall pretty good performance in 2022 in the World Cup, but seems like there's always excuses made for that team. For me, it's not comparable to the U.S. just because I think the U.S. could have easily gone to that situation that Brazil was in, if not a better one, with the talent that Brazil has. And it's one of those things where I think Brazil is almost like a good metaphor for the state of the tournament as a whole, where it sounds good on paper, but in reality, watching it makes you want to change the channel. So I don't know if anyone feels the same way about Brazil. I think obviously everyone can agree that they're bad, but they've been a team that I'm just like, why are they not getting talked about more? I think obviously the Berhalter situation in this country has kind of hijacked the talking points a little bit, but for me, I think Brazil, not to promote like dogging on teams, but like let's get the Brazil being poor, like not being a good team conversation started. I'm here for it personally.
Well, you mentioned on paper how good they look. I would argue on paper they're not that good, especially compared to some Brazilian teams that we've seen in the past. I look at the midfield, and there's people like Douglas Luiz and Bruno Guimaraes and João Gomez and Andres Pereira, all good players. But you think about the history of this, even the recent history of this Brazil national team, and those names don't really hold a candle to some of the other names that we've gotten used to seeing in the past.
They got two 80 million pound players in the midfield, though.
No, I think they're decent players. They're good players, but I think on paper it's nowhere near as strong as of this Brazilian team as they've had in previous years. With that being said, you're right. They still have two $80 million midfielders. They still have Vinicius Jr. They still have Rodrigo. They still have Alisson in goal. Marquinhos at the back. Eder Militao. These are still world-class players, and they did not play like a world-class team. It looked, particularly in that first game against Costa Rica, like they were void of ideas, void of attacking ideas to try to break down that low block, and they got frustrated by what Costa Rica was doing. And I think it's an incredibly disappointing tournament for Brazil, who, if you think about it now, they haven't won a World Cup since 2002. They for so long were the standard, the international standard for soccer. Yes, they won the Copa America in 2019, but the last 20 plus years for this Brazil national team, despite having more talented teams in that period, really it's a story of underachievement. And I feel like you're mentioning, Griffin, it's not talked about that much because of the history of Brazil and the flair, and they're fun to watch a lot of the times. But a lot of those teams that were fun to watch, say maybe 2018, 2006, those World Cup teams still crashed out earlier than they would have liked to. And this team was not even fun to watch, and they still crashed out than they wanted to.
Can I add really quick? I think when you mentioned they're looking back on the glory days and they have all these star players, I think I see that they're desperately trying to cling on to that. And I think a big part of that is they found a guy at Endrick who the media has really gravitated towards as potentially the next guy. And quite honestly, that he should have never been in the starting lineup for that knockout stage game. in my opinion, James, feel free to disagree with me on this, but you should never be starting a 5'8", 17-year-old with zero international experience in a big knockout stage. I don't care. Like, they have better guys who would fit that system more. And we saw it at the end of the day. It was embarrassing. Endrick's only created pass was the kickoff, which was a stat that when I originally saw it, I thought it was fake. Like, I genuinely was like, this cannot be true. But it was. And honestly, you have so many good options, especially in that attack. They might be weak at some points in the midfield, but they are not lacking creativity going forward. You have Vinicius Jr., Rodrigo, Savio played really well. You have Rafinha. You even have Richarlison, who has shown that he can play well on the big stage for Brazil. I don't think, especially against a physical team like Uruguay, that Endrick was the right call. And I think that they almost have like I don't even want to say, like, it's crossing sports, but it's almost like the Yankees mentality, where it's like, I think there's a section of fans that think because they were good, they're still going to be good. And they have some of the most talented players in the world, but then they just kind of are like, well, I'm just going to send them out there and hope they play well, and not really try to get deeper with what they're doing wrong, potentially tactically. And I think that it's going to cost them dearly. And I don't know. I mean, obviously, players like Endrick will develop before the next tournament, but it is something to be very scared about if you're a Brazil fan. James, I know you were shaking your head.
Just to touch on the Endrick thing, I think you make a great point about the physicality of that match. But what I was going to bring up before is that Vinicius Jr. was suspended for it, picked up 2 yellow cards in the final 2 matches of that group stage, which is what prompted them to make that call. I think Dorival Jr., the coach of Brazil, has got a lot of questions to answer. I do, Nick. I want to go back to what you said. You think that the squad isn't that impressive, especially compared to Brazil teams of the past. I almost forgot that they were that disappointing at this Copa America, because I think that they're a worse team than Uruguay on paper, and I think that Uruguay team rightfully should have won. Now there's a 74th minute red card in that game for Naitan Nandez, the right back for Uruguay. If there's extra time at this Copa America in the knockout games, maybe Brazil win that game outright and it doesn't go to penalties. So I think that's one discussion point. I'm not making excuses for Brazil. They aren't as good as they should be. But there's 2 things. Their best player gets 2 yellow cards in the group stage and is out, and there's no extra time to the opposing team's after the opposing team's red card in the knockout. So I think the Copa America, the whole yellow cards thing is in every international tournament. The no extra time during the knockouts bothered me, because I think Ecuador also could have beaten Argentina. That Argentina were dead tired at the end of that 90 minutes, and Ecuador were just growing into the game. That could have gone a very different way. So I think that's another thing to bring up about the tournament. Staying with Brazil, yes, I don't think that they're as good as Brazil teams of the past, but since 2002, the pressure has been insurmountable for what has been some fantastic players. And look, they miss Neymar a lot at this tournament. Absolutely miss Neymar, who, by the way, still is one of the best players in the world for my money. One of the most disrespected players at the top level of this game. I think he did more for the Brazil national team than a guy like Ronaldinho did, even though he did win a World Cup. I think Neymar alone can affect his team more than a lot of Brazilian national team players of the past. That's not to say, though, that there weren't periods in which Brazil weren't always dominant on the international stage. I think that's just the culture that we grew up in and we're used to. There were periods in the 80s and late 70s, 80s where it was Argentina, their era in South America, where they took over. And that's what it's been now for the past generation. Talking about World Cup cycle generations, it's been Argentina. I think the 90s and early 2000s was Brazil. And, the late 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s, the Pele era was Brazil's time. But it's not shocking that, there's ebbs and flows to international football. It's just Brazil's time where they have to go back to the drawing board. Yes, I think Endrick maybe wasn't the best call to start in that specific match, but his skill set is incredible. He's going to only get better. He will be the guy for this Brazil national team at some point. I truly believe that. I got to see him play in person against Spain at the Bernabeu this past March. The 2 best players on the field in that game, 16-year-old Lamine Yamal, 17-year-old Endrick. So I think that the future is bright for him. I think Brazil are going to have to figure things out. Dorival Jr. is going to be the coach at the 2026 World Cup. They confirmed that. I don't know if the Brazilian fans are too happy about it. I'd imagine that they aren't. They're a big
What's in
team.
the air
They've
with
got to figure
coaches,
it out.
man? What's in the air with coaches in this international guy? James, you brought up a really good point with Argentina's coach. There really does need to be just a whole breakdown of what makes a good. Like, we need an international coach renaissance because it's clearly not working. And I think it is definitely something that when you look at, like, I don't know, I feel like teams take club coaches that coach and work with a team almost completely year round, 9 months out of the year. They play over 60 plus games with them. I think teams need to realize that you're going to need a different type of skill set for a guy that sees them maybe 3 times a year and then twice every 8 years in big tournaments. I think that's something that might end up being the storyline of 2026 as well. I think we might see potential a guy to bring it back to the Copa America, I guess in 2028 Copa America, going off the international tournaments. I think we saw it in the Euros with more unorthodox coaches like Rangnick. I think I would leave it to a team maybe next time this tournament rolls around that has a new guy in that's a little bit more like developmentally focused and is trying to maybe do something a little more exciting. I think it's definitely, I will say, for all the trash I have talked about this tournament, I was with my friends watching the final yesterday, and I thought, man, Argentina will be good, but they won't be as good in 2028. And there's a lot more teams that are and there's a lot more teams that are going to potentially challenge. I think as a whole that will be good, and hopefully CONMEBOL can get their act together, and there is a bright future for this tournament going forward because I don't want the U.S. home soil tournaments to be bad. I don't want the North and South America tournaments to be bad, but it's the current state we're in. So I think, I guess these podcasts always end me pleading to someone, but please, if you are running this tournament, either CONCACAF, CONMEBOL, just get your act together. And if you're a team in either of those federations, I don't know, you guys get paid millions of dollars if you're high up. Find a good coach. It's really not that hard.
You're talking about coaching, and I know we're going over on time. We're just so excited to talk about it. We haven't talked about how bad Mexico were yet, and I have to get my piece in here. You're talking about teams not figuring out a coach. Mexico are in a dire situation, arguably worse situation. Actually, no, it's not arguably. They're in a worse situation than the U.S. Right now. Jimmy Lozano was brought back in after Diego Coca, after they got embarrassed 3-0 at the Nations League in 2023 by the U.S. And Jimmy Lozano might not survive now. It looks like they're going to bring in Javier Aguirre, but Jimmy Lozano might still be his assistant at the national team. They are an absolute mess. They scored 1 goal at this tournament, and it was by struggling left back Gerardo Arteaga, who really couldn't find time in the Belgian league and had to go back to Monterrey, where he still is the backup left back to oh my god, why am I blanking on Mexican left back Jesus Gallardo? Jesus Gallardo, who's a forgettable player. I just did it just then. Like, this is a Mexico team that, while we love beating up on them with the US, like we have done since every game since 2021, we have to take a step back and realize just how dire the situation is for this Mexico national team. One of the most poorly set up generations. This makes the 2018 US cycle team look not as bad as they were. And that's not to mention, like, Mexico haven't really been great on the international scale, even in the last 10, 12 years. Even the times where they were dominating the US, they almost didn't qualify for the 2014 World Cup. They got lucky to get out of their group in 2018 despite beating that Germany team. They got a favor from Korea on the final match day, and then they didn't get out of their group in 2022 and struggled at times in World Cup qualifying. This Mexico team has been on the downhill trajectory when you look back for the past decade or so. And as a US fan, that excites me, but as someone who understands that CONCACAF needs to be good in order for the US to be good, this is bad. The US and Mexico need to be in much better shape going into this coming World Cup, and they're not, and that's going to reflect poorly on the entire region around us.
I think it was telling in regards to this, bring it back to this tournament as a whole. When last night's final went into extra time. I was like, I have to watch 30 more minutes of this. Like, I have to sit here and watch 30 more minutes. And I'm obviously going to watch it. I love the sport. But I think that's telling of how this tournament went as a whole. I think we talked about when we were talking about the Euros, we ended on saying how we all really enjoyed this tournament and we are sad that it's over. This Copa America, I think in my head, because it was being hosted in the US, I thought it was going to be more similar to maybe the 2016 Copa America in regards to organization and all of that. But it was like any other Copa America in regards to sort of the style of the play on the field and also the incompetence off it. And for me, I think we'll end on this. To me, it was a disappointing tournament. And I think whether it's empty seats, whether it's the size of the pitches, whether it's the actual quality of soccer that we got to see, overall, I was kind of left with a bad taste in my mouth after the end of last night, thinking back on this tournament as a whole. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, I would give the overall experience of the 2024 Copa America a stiff D minus, maybe.
I'd agree with that.
Just like a really, really overall bad look, bad product. Failed to be entertaining at times.
It was always in contrast to, because when Copa America used to be in the year after the World Cup, whether it was 2015, 2019, and there was no other, the Euros weren't going on, you don't really have anything to compare it to. But when you had the Euros going on in the afternoon and then the Copa America at night, the contrast between the two and the levels of each tournament, it was just on such clear display which one was better.
Yeah, I can handle good football. I can handle bad football, but at the end of the day, what I can't handle is boring football. And there was a lot of that in this tournament, and I think that is the biggest issue that needs to be fixed.
And you know what? That's important that you mentioned that, because you know what's not a boring tournament, as bad as it can be and as empty the stadiums can be? The Gold Cup. Gold Cup games are always like exciting. Guatemala versus Guadeloupe at Red Bull Arena was one of the most fun matches I've watched in a long time. The quality on the field does not have to be superstar players, but there was a lot that the organizers got wrong, and it made for a worse product. I agree. Let's see if the Olympics can.
One thing I will add, which doesn't help, I think with the Euros, you have a little bit more of fans of the actual country that they are rooting for, and I get it that people like players and you like Messi a lot. But I was watching the Copa America final, and I will tell you what, I went and asked, not a single person cheering for the Argentinian winner was Argentinian. And I get that you support players like that, but I just think the camaraderie aspect is gone to a certain extent with the Copa America.
Yeah, and I think about a tournament like AFCON, the games that I watch, so much more fun than Copa America. And I think it's finally time to put a bow on it and just put it in the rearview mirror. It happened. It was disappointing, but I think that'll just about wrap up our Copa America roundup. Disappointing tournament overall. Argentina go back to back to back. Please don't talk to me. Please don't compare them to Spain, because that's going to get me. It's going to get me riled up. But they still do deserve their flowers. But for Nick Guzman, James Birle, Griffin Stevenson saying so long, and I'm saying so long to this Copa America, and thank God it's over.